We didn't realize something was beneath us until it had already been there for a while. Not moving, not drifting, just holding position directly under the ship. At the time, nothing about that night stood out. The ocean was calm in a way that makes everything feel routine. No waves breaking against the hull, no wind pushing across the deck. Just open water stretching in every direction, dark and flat under a sky that barely gave off any light. Inside sonar control, it was the same as always. Low hum of equipment, soft voices, screens filled with data that behaved exactly the way it should. I remember thinking it was going to be an easy watch. We were hours into patrol, well outside any traffic zones. No surface contacts, no unusual comms, nothing requiring attention beyond standard monitoring. All my job at that point was mostly repetition. Scan, confirm, log, repeat. The kind of work where your eyes stay active, but your mind starts to drift if you let it. That's probably why I almost missed it. The first return was so faint, it didn't register as anything important. Just a brief flicker on the display. Low intensity, inconsistent, gone before it could fully form. I didn't react. Didn't mark it. Because things like that happen all the time. Small disturbances, minor interference, signals that appear and disappear without meaning anything. You learn early on not to chase every one of them. Still, I kept an eye on that area, not because it looked significant, just because something about it didn't feel like the usual noise. A few seconds passed, then a minute, nothing. I adjusted the gain slightly, ran a quick system check. Everything came back normal. Clean readings, no distortion, no reason to question anything. Then it came back. This time it stayed longer, still faint but more defined, not scattered like biological activity, not drifting like current interference. It was centered. I leaned in a little closer to the screen, narrowing my focus. The return held for just a moment longer than before, then faded again. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because when it disappeared, it didn't feel gone. I sat there for a few seconds, watching the same spot, waiting for it to behave like everything else we tracked. It didn't. When it returned again, it was in the exact same position, same depth range, same location, directly beneath us. That was the first time I paused, not because it was strong, not because it was clear, but because it repeated, and repetition means something. I adjusted the display again, filtering out background noise, trying to isolate the signal. It appeared again, slightly stronger now, holding just long enough to confirm it wasn't random. Getting a faint return under us, I said, not taking my eyes off the screen. The operator beside me glanced over. Probably nothing, he said. Maybe. That's what it should have been. But I didn't look away, because most returns, real or false, don't come back in the exact same place unless something is causing them to. And at that moment, we didn't know what that was. I marked the time, not because I thought it was important yet, just because it didn't behave like everything else. The ocean outside remained completely still. No change in movement, no shift in conditions. From anywhere else on the ship, it would have felt like a normal night. But in that room, something had started. Quietly, without warning, and easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. The signal returned again, stronger this time, longer, still centered, still beneath us. And that's when it stopped feeling like background noise. Not enough to raise alarm, not enough to call it a contact, but enough to create a question, one that didn't have an answer yet, because whatever it was It wasn't moving. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't fading away. It was staying. And the longer I watched it, the more it felt like we hadn't just detected something. We had noticed something that was already there. It didn't drift away like it should have. That was the first thing that stopped feeling normal. Most false returns fade out or shift with the water. Even real contacts, marine life, debris, anything loose, move with currents, change position, break apart on the screen. This didn't do any of that. It came back and held, stronger than before, steady enough now that I didn't have to question whether I was seeing it correctly. The shape was still undefined, but its position wasn't. Same depth band, same location, directly beneath us. I adjusted the display again, narrowing the range, trying to get a cleaner read. The signal sharpened slightly, but not in a way that made it easier to identify. It didn't match anything familiar. No propeller signature, no rhythmic pattern, no scatter you'd expect from biological movement. Just a consistent return. "All right, that's not normal," the operator next to me said quietly. I didn't respond right away. I was watching how long it would stay. 5 seconds. 10. Still there. That was enough to rule out most of the usual explanations. "Run a full system check," I said. He nodded and started going through diagnostics while I kept eyes on the contact. If this was equipment related, something would show up. Signal distortion, calibration issues, anything. But the display remained stable, and so did the contact. "Systems are clean," he said after a moment. "No faults." That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. I marked the position again, this time more carefully, logging depth and intensity. There was no noticeable change between appearances. Whatever we were picking up wasn't random. It was repeating with consistency that didn't make sense for interference. "Could be something large," someone else offered from behind us. "Like what?" I asked. No one answered, because anything large enough to produce that kind of return should have been easier to identify, and it should have moved. We were underway at a steady speed, not fast, but enough that anything below us should have shifted position relative to the ship. Even a submerged object would have passed out of range after a few moments. This didn't. I pulled up additional data, checking for any environmental factors, thermal layers, salinity changes, anything that could distort readings. There were minor variations, nothing unusual for open water, nothing that could explain a fixed return like that. Then it happened again. The signal strengthened. Not dramatically, but enough that it became harder to ignore. It wasn't flickering anymore. It was holding continuously now, like it had settled into place. "Depth?" the supervisor asked as he stepped into the room. I gave him the range. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at the display, arms crossed, studying it longer than I expected. "Confirm it's not us," he said. "Already checked," I replied. "No internal reflection, no hull noise. It's external." He nodded slightly, but his expression didn't change. "Any movement?" I hesitated for a second. "None," I said. "It's holding position." That was the part that didn't sit right with me. We were moving forward through open ocean. There was nothing anchoring anything beneath us. No seafloor close enough, no structure, no known obstacle. And yet, whatever this was hadn't shifted even a fraction. "Let's verify," he said. Orders came through to make a slight course adjustment. Nothing aggressive, just enough to see if the contact would change relative position. I watched closely as the ship altered heading. A few seconds passed. The contact stayed exactly where it was, still centered, still beneath us. No delay, no drift, just locked. A quiet tension settled into the room. No one said it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing now. That shouldn't be possible. "Adjust speed," the supervisor said. The engines responded, increasing slightly. The vibration through the deck changed just enough to feel. I kept my eyes on the display. The contact didn't move. Not forward, not back. It remained fixed beneath the hull, as if the change in speed didn't apply to it. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a glitch, went and started feeling like something else. "Run it again," he said. We did. Another adjustment. Slight turn, minor speed variation. Same result, perfect alignment. No lag, no correction. It didn't follow us. It stayed with us. I leaned back slightly, just enough to take a breath, but my eyes never left the screen. Because now the question wasn't whether the signal was real. It was how long it had been there, before we noticed it. No one spoke for a while after that. The usual background noise of the room had faded. Conversation stopped. Even the small, routine comments disappeared. All attention was on that single return, holding steady, silent, and exactly where it shouldn't be. We needed to prove it was reacting, not just appearing that way. Up until that point, and there was still a small part of me trying to fit it into something familiar, some kind of anomaly, a rare but explainable glitch. But the longer it held position, the harder that became. So Command decided to test it properly. Nothing aggressive, just controlled movement. The kind you use when you're trying to understand behavior without drawing attention to the fact that you're studying it. "Prepare for maneuver," came the order. It was calm, routine, the same tone used for any standard adjustment, but the room felt different now. I adjusted my position, focusing entirely on the display. Every detail mattered: timing, spacing, how quickly the contact responded. If there was any delay at all, we'd see it. The ship began a gradual turn, nothing sharp, just enough to shift our heading a few degrees. I watched the contact closely. All for a moment, nothing changed. Then it moved. Not after the turn completed, not after a delay. It moved with us. Perfectly. The alignment didn't break for even a second. No drift, no correction. It stayed directly beneath the hull as if it had anticipated the movement before it happened. I felt my grip tighten slightly on the edge of the console. "Did you see that?" someone asked quietly. No one needed to answer. We all saw it. "Run it again," the supervisor said. This time, the adjustment was slightly more pronounced. A clearer shift in direction, enough that any passive object would fall out of alignment, even briefly. The ship turned, and again, the contact held. No delay, no hesitation, just immediate, precise repositioning. "That's not current," someone muttered. "No," the supervisor replied. "It's not." There was a pause after that. Not long, but long enough for the realization to settle in. We weren't observing something reacting to the environment. We were observing something reacting to us. "Speed change," the order came next. The engines responded, pushing us forward slightly faster than before. The vibration through the deck deepened, subtle but noticeable. I kept my eyes locked on the return. If there was going to be a break, this would be it. Anything without propulsion or without intelligence would lag behind, even for a moment. But it didn't. The contact adjusted instantly, still centered, still fixed, as if the change in speed had no effect on its ability to remain exactly where it was. That was when the room went completely quiet. No background chatter, no side conversations, just the low hum of equipment and the steady presence of something we couldn't explain. "All right," the supervisor said, his voice lower now. "Let's push it a little." The next maneuver was sharper. A controlled but more aggressive turn, combined with a slight drop in speed. This wasn't standard anymore. This was a deliberate attempt to break whatever was happening. The ship shifted. For the first time, there was a brief moment, barely noticeable, where the contact seemed to lag. Less than a second. Then it corrected, snapped back into position beneath us with a precision that didn't feel natural. I felt a chill run through me, though the room temperature hadn't changed. Because that moment, that tiny delay, it didn't look like something struggling to keep up. It looked like something adjusting, learning. "Again," the supervisor said, but this time there was something different in his tone, less curiosity, more caution. We repeated the maneuver, different angle, slight variation in speed. The result was the same. Every movement we made, it matched. Not randomly, not approximately, exactly. I leaned in closer, studying the return as if I could force it to make a mistake. But it didn't. It stayed consistent, predictable in the most unsettling way possible, because it wasn't just following, it was anticipating. "That's enough," the supervisor said finally. No one argued. There was no need to. We had our answer. Whatever was beneath us wasn't passive. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't caught in some environmental condition we didn't understand. It was tracking us, deliberately. And for the first time since it appeared, I stopped thinking about what it could be and started thinking about why it was there. Because it hadn't lost us once, not for a second. And something about that felt less like coincidence and more like intention. It should have been making noise. That was the part none of us could get past. Anything moving underwater, anything with mass, speed, or propulsion, creates a signature. You hear it before you fully track it. Even the quietest submarines leave something behind. A faint rhythm, a disturbance, some kind of trace you can work with. This had none of that, not even a hint. I adjusted the filters again, isolating different frequency bands, stripping away background noise layer by layer. If there was anything there, any mechanical sound, any biological pattern, it would show up somewhere. But every pass came back the same, clean, empty. And yet the contact remained, still locked beneath us, just as precise as before. "Check passive again," the supervisor said. "I've run it 3 times, I replied. "There's nothing." He stepped closer, leaning in just enough to study the display himself. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The room stayed quiet around us, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. This one felt heavier. "Active ping," he said. That got a few looks. Active wasn't something you used lightly. It announces your position, sends a clear signal out into the water. But at this point, we needed something more than passive readings. "Send it," he added. I triggered the pulse. The sound itself wasn't audible in the room, but you feel it through the system. A brief shift, like the equipment takes a breath and releases it into the water. We waited. The return came back almost instantly, and strong, clear, and unmistakable. The object was still there, same position, same depth. But even with active sonar, something was wrong. The shape of the return didn't resolve the way it should have. There was no clear outline, No defined edges, just a dense, consistent mass that absorbed the signal differently than anything I'd seen before. "Run it again," he said. I did. Same result, strong return, no definition, like the signal was hitting something, but not interacting with it properly. "That doesn't make sense," someone said, quietly from the back. They were right. Even unknown objects reflect sound in predictable ways. You get angles, variations, something that gives you an idea of structure. This didn't. It was like the sound hit it and just stopped. No scatter, no bounce variation. Just a flat, solid presence. "Kill active," the supervisor said after a moment. I shut it down. The room returned to passive listening, and with it, the silence came back. Complete. If I hadn't just seen the active return, I wouldn't have believed anything was there. But it was, still holding, still directly beneath us. I switched back through frequency ranges again, slower this time, more deliberate. There had to be something we were missing, some faint indicator buried in the noise. But there was nothing. No propeller wash, no engine hum, no movement signature. Nothing that suggested it was operating in water the way anything should. "How is it moving?" the operator beside me asked under his breath. I didn't answer, because I didn't have one. Movement requires energy. Energy creates sound. Even minimal systems leave traces. This had none, and yet we had already seen it adjust perfectly to every maneuver we made. I leaned back slightly, letting my eyes move away from the display for the first time in a while. The room felt different now, not tense in the usual way, not alert, just quiet, too quiet, like everyone was waiting for something else to happen, something worse. "Could be masking," someone suggested. "Not like this," the supervisor replied. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Whatever kind of technology could eliminate all acoustic signature while maintaining that level of precision. It wasn't anything we were familiar with. I looked back at the screen. The contact hadn't shifted at all. Same depth, same position, still there. But now the absence of sound felt different. Before, it was confusing. Now it was unsettling. Because silence underwater isn't natural when something is moving. It's deliberate. And the longer I stared at that empty audio field, the more it felt like we weren't failing to detect it. The more it felt like it was choosing not to be heard. I exhaled slowly, barely noticing I'd been holding my breath. Because up until that moment, we had been focused on what we could see, the position, the movement, the way it tracked us. But now there was something else to consider, not what it was doing, but what it wasn't. No sound, no trace, no explanation, just a presence that followed every move we made, without leaving anything behind. And for the first time since it appeared, the silence itself started to feel like the most unnatural part of it, like it wasn't empty at all, just controlled. They didn't rush in. That was the first sign this wasn't being treated like a normal anomaly. Usually, when something unusual shows up, especially something that doesn't fit immediately, there's a shift. Faster voices, more questions, a sense of urgency that spreads through the room. This time, it was controlled. The door opened quietly, and the first officer stepped in without announcing himself. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask for a rundown right away. He just moved closer to the consoles, watching the displays like he'd already been briefed before arriving. That told me this wasn't just local anymore. Word had already gone up the chain. Status, he said, calm, even. The supervisor gave a short summary. No speculation, just facts. Position, duration, behavior. I kept my eyes on the screen while they spoke, but I was listening closely. Not just to what was being said, but how it was being said. No one was guessing anymore. No one was trying to explain it away. "Still holding?" the officer asked. "Yes, sir," I answered. "No deviation." He leaned in slightly, studying the return. His expression didn't change, but he stayed there longer than most would have for something unconfirmed. "Any classification?" "No, sir." That word hung in the air for a moment. No classification. That doesn't happen often. Everything we track usually falls into some category: biological, environmental, mechanical. Even unknowns tend to lean in one direction. This didn't. "Rules of engagement?" someone asked from the back. The officer didn't look away from the display. "Observe only," he said. "No active escalation unless directed." That confirmed it. We weren't here to identify it anymore. We were here to watch it. A second officer entered not long after. Then another. No noise, no urgency. Just a quiet increase in presence. Each one took position without getting in the way, eyes moving between displays, listening more than speaking. The room started to feel smaller. Not physically, but in the way attention tightens when something matters more than it should. "Log everything," the first officer added. "Timestamps, adjustments, responses. I want a full sequence." "Yes, sir." I started recording more precisely now, noting every movement we made and how the contact reacted. The pattern hadn't changed, but now it felt like we were documenting something important, not just monitoring an anomaly. "Any change after active?" he asked. "No, sir. Same behavior. No acoustic signature." That got a brief glance from him. "Was none?" "None," I repeated. He didn't question it further. That bothered me more than if he had, because it meant he wasn't surprised. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of equipment, the same as before. But now it felt louder, like it was filling in for everything else we weren't saying. "Maintain current operations," he said finally. "No deviation from standard movement unless instructed." "Sir, we already tested," the supervisor started. "I know," the officer cut in, still calm. "Continue as normal." That was the part that shifted something in me. We had already proven it was tracking us. We had already ruled out the obvious explanations. And now we were being told to act like nothing was happening. "Understood," the supervisor said. Orders were orders, but the room didn't settle after that. If anything, the tension became quieter, more focused, because now it felt like we were part of something we weren't being fully told about. I glanced back at the display. The contact hadn't moved. Still there, still perfectly aligned, unchanged by everything we had done so far. "Keep monitoring," the officer said. "Report any variation immediately." "Yes, sir." He stepped back slightly, but didn't leave. None of them did. They stayed, watching, not interfering, not asking unnecessary questions, just observing. And that presence, more than the contact itself, changed the atmosphere completely. Because this wasn't curiosity anymore. It wasn't confusion. It felt like recognition. Like they had seen something like this before. Or at least knew enough not to react the way we expected. I shifted slightly in my seat, trying to stay focused on the data. But my attention kept pulling back to one thought. Not what we were seeing, but how it was being handled. Quiet, controlled, contained. And that was the moment it stopped feeling like an isolated event, because whatever was beneath us was now something command was paying very close attention to, and they weren't telling us why. Time should have moved faster than it did. On a normal watch, you feel the hours pass in pieces. Routine checks, quiet conversations, small changes in activity. There's a rhythm to it. Even in silence, there's progression. That night, it stalled. I remember glancing at the clock, expecting more time to have passed than it had. It didn't make sense. We had already run multiple tests, logged repeated behavior, and escalated it up the chain. It felt like we'd been sitting there for hours. It hadn't even been one. "Hold your positions," came the order. That wasn't unusual on its own. Sometimes situations require continuity, keeping the same people on station to maintain consistency. But usually, that comes with a time frame. This didn't. No estimate. No mention of rotation. Just hold. I shifted slightly in my seat, adjusting my posture. My eyes were starting to feel the strain, but I didn't look away from the display for long. Every time I did, even for a second, it felt like I might miss something important. The contact was still there, exactly where it had been, unchanged. That was the part that made time feel heavier. Nothing evolved, nothing resolved. It just continued. "How long has it been now?" someone asked quietly. 40 minutes, another replied. It didn't sound right. 40 minutes should have felt shorter, or longer, but not like this. "Feels like longer," the first voice said. No one disagreed. I checked the logs again, confirming timestamps, making sure we weren't misreading anything. Everything lined up, every entry, every adjustment, every observation. It had all happened within that same window, and the contact hadn't changed once. "Still no variation?" one of the officers asked. "No, sir," I said. "Same position, same depth." He nodded, but didn't respond further. That silence had become familiar now. Questions followed by acknowledgement. No explanation. No direction beyond continuing to observe. I leaned forward slightly, focusing on the display again. The longer I stared at it, the more it started to feel less like a reading, and more like a fixed point, like it belonged there, which didn't make sense. Nothing should remain that stable beneath a moving vessel for that long. Even something tracking us should show minor inconsistencies, delays, corrections, small deviations. There were none. "Eyes getting tired?" the operator beside me muttered. "A little," I admitted. "Yeah." That was all he said. Normally, there'd be more. Small talk, something to break the monotony. Not tonight. Everyone stayed focused. Not because we were told to, because we didn't want to miss it if something changed. Another 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Still no shift change. I felt it in my shoulders first, then in my neck. The kind of tension that builds slowly when you don't move enough, when your attention stays locked in one direction for too long. But stepping away didn't feel like an option, even if it had been allowed. "Request rotation?" someone asked from the back. The response came quickly. "Negative. Maintain current watch." That was the second time. More direct now. No explanation. Just no. I glanced briefly toward the officers. They hadn't moved much since they arrived. Same positions, same quiet observation. No signs of fatigue, no visible reaction to the time passing. That stood out, because everyone else was starting to feel it, not just physically, mentally. The longer the contact stayed unchanged, the harder it became to process. It didn't behave like something real, but it was there, constant, unmoving in the only way that mattered. I blinked a few times, trying to clear my focus. The display hadn't shifted, not even slightly. "How long do we keep this up?" the same voice asked again, quieter this time. No answer. Must because no one in the room had that information. Or if they did, they weren't sharing it. Another stretch of silence followed, longer than the others, heavy in a way that made every small sound stand out. The hum of the equipment, the faint movement of someone adjusting their stance, the soft tap of fingers against a console, and underneath all of it, that presence, still there, still locked beneath us. I checked the time again. It had moved, but it didn't feel like it, because nothing else had. No change in behavior, no escalation, no resolution, just the same signal, repeating the same impossible pattern. And the longer we stayed in that room without rotation, the more it started to feel like we weren't just observing it anymore. We were being kept there, not by orders, but by the fact that none of us were willing to look away. Because if it changed, if it did anything different at all, we needed to be there to see it. And something about that made the time feel even slower, like it wasn't just passing, it was waiting. We weren't supposed to try anything aggressive. That was clear from the beginning. Observe only, maintain course, no unnecessary deviation. But after a while, staying still started to feel like the risk. No one said it directly, but the thought was there. If something could hold position beneath us for that long, perfectly, without error, then continuing as normal wasn't really normal anymore. It was just waiting. "Request maneuver," the supervisor said, breaking the silence. There was a pause, not long, just enough to remind everyone that this wasn't a decision made at our level. "Approved," came the response. Short, controlled, no follow-up. That was all we needed. "All right," the supervisor said, quietly. "Let's see what it does." The first adjustment was subtle, a gradual increase in speed, just enough to change our movement profile without making it obvious. The engines responded with a low shift in vibration, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. I was. My eyes stayed locked on the display. For a second, nothing changed. Then the contact adjusted, instantly, still centered, still directly beneath us. No drift, no delay. "Same behavior," I said. "Noted." There was no surprise in his voice, just confirmation. "Try lateral." The ship began a controlled turn, altering heading more noticeably this time. Not sharp, but enough that anything beneath us, anything passive, should have slipped out of alignment, even briefly. I watched closely. The contact didn't slip. It didn't lag. It moved with us, perfectly. "Again," he said. This time, the maneuver was combined. Slight increase in speed with a sharper turn. A pattern designed to disrupt tracking, to force a reaction that would expose limitations. But there were none. Every movement we made, it matched. Clean, immediate, like it was connected to us. "That's not possible," someone said under their breath. No one corrected him, because at that point, we all knew it. "Push it," the supervisor said. The next adjustment was more aggressive. A sharper turn than before, paired with a noticeable drop in speed. The deck vibration shifted, more pronounced this time. You could feel it through your feet, through the console. This wasn't routine anymore. This was testing limits. I leaned in slightly, focusing on the contact, waiting for it to break, just for a moment. Anything. A delay, a correction, a mistake. For a fraction of a second, it did. Barely. A slight offset. so small it could have been missed if you weren't watching closely. Then it snapped back. Perfect alignment, faster than anything I'd ever seen. I felt it in my chest before I realized what I was reacting to. That moment wasn't random. It wasn't the contact struggling to keep up. It was adjusting. "Did you log that?" the supervisor asked. "Yes," I said, already marking the time. Again. We repeated the maneuver. Same pattern. Slight variation in angle. This time, no delay at all. Just immediate correction, like it had already learned. The room went quiet again. Not the same quiet as before. This one felt tighter. Focused. Because now we weren't just observing behavior. We were seeing consistency in how it adapted. "Change speed again," he said. The engines responded, pushing us faster than before. Not full acceleration, but enough to create a noticeable difference. I watched the display. The contact stayed with us. No hesitation, no adjustment phase. Just there, locked in place. It didn't matter what we did, speed up, slow down, turn, shift. Nothing broke the connection. "Try reverse variation," he said. A slight reduction, followed by a quick increase. A pattern designed to disrupt prediction. The contact didn't care. It remained exactly where it was. At that point, the maneuvers weren't about testing anymore. They were about confirming what we already suspected. We couldn't lose it. "All right," the supervisor said finally, his voice quieter now. "That's enough." No one argued, because there was nothing left to test. We had changed everything we could: speed, direction, timing. And it had responded to all of it the same way. Perfectly. I leaned back slightly, just enough to release some of the tension in my shoulders. But my eyes didn't leave the screen, because now the situation felt different. Before, it was confusion. Then it was concern. Now, it was something else. Because whatever was beneath us hadn't just followed our movements. It had stayed ahead of them. And that meant one thing we hadn't wanted to say out loud. It wasn't reacting to what we did. It was anticipating it. And no matter what we tried, we couldn't shake it. The numbers didn't match anything we understood. At first, we were too focused on position, how it tracked us, how it held directly beneath the hull. But once the maneuvers stopped, once everything settled again, attention shifted to something we hadn't fully questioned yet: its depth. "Confirm range," the supervisor said. I already had it on screen, but I recalibrated anyway, narrowed the band, cleaned the signal as much as possible. The reading came back the same. I gave him the number. There was a pause. "Run it again." I did. Same result. "Depth stable?" he asked. "No, sir," I replied. "It's fluctuating." That was new, not wildly, not erratically, but enough to stand out. The contact wasn't holding a fixed depth anymore. It was shifting, slowly at first, then more noticeably. "Track the change," he said. I started logging it in real time. The numbers moved, down, then up, then down again. But the speed of those changes didn't make sense. "Rate of movement?" he asked. I calculated quickly, comparing timestamps between readings. Then I stopped, because the result didn't line up with anything reasonable. "Say again," he said. I gave him the rate. This time, the pause lasted longer. "That's not right," someone said quietly. No one disagreed, because at that speed, nothing should be able to move vertically like that underwater. Not without creating massive disturbance. Not without generating noise, pressure changes, something we could detect. But there was nothing, no turbulence, no acoustic trace, just the numbers shifting in a way that shouldn't be possible. Could it be reading error? Another operator suggested. I shook my head before answering. I've recalibrated twice. It's consistent. Cross-check with secondary. Already ahead of that. Matches, I said. The room went quiet again. Not confused this time. Focused. Because this wasn't just unusual anymore. It was contradicting what we knew. The contact dropped again. Faster this time. The depth reading shifted in a way that made my stomach tighten slightly. Not because of what it meant, but because of how quickly it happened. Log that, the supervisor said. Already on it. Seconds later, it reversed, climbing back up, just as fast. No transition, no gradual change, just movement, clean, direct, like resistance didn't exist. That depth, it shouldn't be able to come back from that, someone said. They were right. At those levels, pressure alone would crush most known structures. Even specialized equipment has limits. There are boundaries you don't cross without consequences. This thing crossed them and came back like it didn't matter. Maintain tracking, the supervisor said, his voice steady, but lower now. I adjusted the display again, focusing entirely on depth variation. If there was a pattern, any kind of rhythm, we might be able to understand what it was doing, but there wasn't one. The movement didn't repeat. It didn't follow a cycle. It just changed. Up, down, pause, then another shift. Each movement precise, each change controlled, and through all of it, it never lost position beneath us. That was the part that stayed constant. No matter how deep it went, no matter how fast it moved vertically, it stayed aligned, directly under the hull. How is it holding position during that? The operator next to me asked. No one answered, because that was the question. Not just how it moved, but how it maintained alignment while doing it. Vertical movement at that speed should disrupt everything. Balance, positioning, tracking. But it didn't. It was like the two things were independent, as if depth didn't affect position. I stared at the numbers, watching them shift again, this time slower, more controlled, almost deliberate. Feels like it's testing something, someone muttered. I didn't respond, but I thought the same thing, because the movements didn't feel random anymore. They felt measured, like it was exploring limits, not ours, its own. The contact dipped again, not as deep this time, then rose slightly, then stopped, holding at a new level, still beneath us, still perfectly aligned. The room stayed quiet. No one moved. No one looked away. Because at that point, we weren't just dealing with something unknown. We were dealing with something that didn't follow the same rules. And the deeper it went, the clearer that became. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath again. Because every time the numbers changed, there was this brief moment where it felt like it might go too far, like it might reach a point where it couldn't come back. But it always did, without delay, without struggle, without leaving any trace behind. And that was the part that stayed with me. Not how deep it went, not how fast it moved, but how easily it ignored the limits that should have stopped it, like they didn't apply, like whatever was beneath us was operating under something completely different, and we were just watching it happen, without understanding any of it. At some point, the sound stopped mattering, not because it changed, but because it didn't. By then, we had gone over every frequency range more times than I could count. Adjusted filters, recalibrated inputs, isolated bands that should have picked up even the faintest disturbance. Nothing. Just the same empty field where something clearly existed. And the longer that silence held, the more noticeable it became. I kept one ear on the audio feed out of habit, even though there was nothing to hear. A steady absence, no fluctuation, no interference, no trace of movement, but the contact was still there. Holding position beneath us, unchanged. It didn't make sense. Silence underwater doesn't work like that. Even in the calmest conditions, there's always something, background noise, distant movement, the ocean itself shifting in subtle ways. This wasn't that. This was clean, controlled. Anything? The supervisor asked. No, sir, I said. Still nothing on passive. He nodded, but didn't respond. Because there was nothing to respond to. We weren't missing data. There just wasn't any. I adjusted the levels again, more out of instinct than expectation. If there was something buried deep enough, maybe we could pull it out, some faint distortion, some hint of activity. But the output remained the same, flat, empty, and that's when it started to feel different. Before, the silence had been confusing. Now, it felt intentional. I leaned back slightly, rubbing the side of my headset against my ear, not to remove it, but just to break the constant pressure of listening to nothing. The room had grown quieter too. No one was talking anymore unless they had to. Even the small exchanges from earlier were gone. Every movement felt deliberate. Every sound stood out more than it should have. A chair shifting. A breath taken too sharply. The faint tap of a finger against a console. All of it seemed louder now, because everything else wasn't. How long has it been silent like this? Someone asked. It hasn't changed, I said, and that was true. From the moment we realized it had no acoustic signature, it never developed one. No variation, no fluctuation, just absence. I glanced back at the display. The contact was still there. Same position, same depth, at least for the moment. No movement, but it didn't feel inactive. That was the problem. Nothing about it felt passive. Even when it wasn't moving, there was this underlying sense that it could, at any time, without warning. Feels wrong, the operator beside me said, quietly. I nodded. Yeah. There wasn't a better way to explain it. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just a growing awareness that something about this situation didn't fit into anything we understood. I adjusted the display again, zooming slightly, focusing on the exact point beneath the hull. Still nothing. No edge, no shape. Just a presence marked by where it wasn't supposed to be. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my breathing. Because the longer we sat there, the more the silence started to press in. Not physically, but mentally. Like the absence of sound was filling the space in a way noise usually would. You ever get that feeling? Someone started, then stopped. No one asked him to finish, because we already knew what he meant. That subtle sense you get sometimes, when something isn't visible, but your mind keeps telling you it's there, watching, waiting. I shifted slightly in my seat, adjusting my posture again. The display hadn't changed. The audio hadn't changed. Nothing had. And yet, everything felt different. Because now we weren't just observing a contact. We were sitting in silence with it. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Hard to tell. Time had started to blur again. The kind of blur that happens when nothing changes, but your awareness stays locked in place. Every second stretched just a little longer than it should. Still there, I said quietly, more to confirm it than to report. No one responded. They didn't need to. We all knew, because none of us had looked away long enough to forget. And that was the part that stayed with me. Not the movement, not the depth, not even the way it tracked us, but the silence. The way it stayed completely untouched by everything around it. Like it wasn't part of the water at all, like it was just there, separate. And the longer we listened to nothing, the more it started to feel like that silence wasn't empty, just occupied, in a way we couldn't detect and couldn't explain. It didn't start all at once. There wasn't a moment where anyone said it out loud or even fully acknowledged it. It just settled in, slowly, quietly, the same way everything else had that night. I noticed it first when I looked away from the display, just for a second, long enough to rest my eyes, to shift my focus somewhere else in the room. But the moment I did, there was this subtle hesitation before I looked back, like something in me didn't want to. I couldn't explain why. Nothing had changed. The contact was still there. The room was the same. But that brief moment, looking away, then returning, felt different. "He's still there?" someone asked. "Yeah," I said. Hasn't moved." That part was automatic now, but the way I said it felt heavier. I leaned forward again, eyes back on the display. Same position, same depth, no variation, still silent. And yet, it didn't feel inactive. That was the problem. The longer we watched it, the harder it became to think of it as just a reading, because it behaved too consistently, too precisely, like it was maintaining that position on purpose. "Anyone else feel that?" the operator beside me asked quietly. I glanced at him. "What?" He hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing, because I knew exactly what he meant. I just didn't want to be the first one to say it. I shifted in my seat again, trying to focus on the data, numbers, readings, anything that kept it grounded in something measurable. But my attention kept pulling back to the same thought. Not what it was doing, but how it felt, like the space around us had changed, not physically, just perceptually. "Keep it together," I muttered under my breath. Not loud enough for anyone else to hear, just enough to remind myself that this was still a system, still data, still something we were trained to handle. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it sharpened. I adjusted the display again, zooming slightly. The contact remained fixed, directly beneath us, unmoving, unchanging. But now every time I looked at it, there was this underlying sense, like it wasn't just something we were observing, like it was aware of being observed. "That doesn't make sense," I said quietly. "What?" the supervisor asked. I paused, then shook my head. "Nothing, sir. Just same behavior." He studied me for a second longer than expected, then nodded. "Stay focused." "Yes, sir." I turned back to the display, but the thought didn't leave, because it wasn't based on anything I could point to. No data, no measurable change, just a feeling. And the worst part was, it wasn't just me. The room had gone quieter than before, not just silent, tense, like everyone was holding something back. "You think it knows," someone said from the back. No one answered. Not because we didn't hear it, because we did, every word, and none of us had a response that made sense. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself again, because that question, it changed the way you looked at the situation. Up until now, we were dealing with something unknown, unidentified, unexplainable, but still something, an object, a contact, into now. It felt like something else. I leaned back slightly, just enough to stretch my shoulders, and for a moment I let my eyes move away from the screen again, across the room. Nothing unusual. Same equipment, same people, same controlled environment. But the feeling didn't go away. It followed, not visually, not in any way I could confirm. Just there, consistent, like a pressure you couldn't quite locate. I turned back to the display. Still there, still beneath us, unchanged. And that was the part that made it worse. Because if it had moved, if it had done anything different, it would have broken the pattern. Given us something to react to, but it didn't. It stayed exactly where it was, as if that position mattered, as if being directly beneath us was intentional. "Eyes up," the supervisor said quietly. I straightened slightly. Still tracking." "Yes, sir." The room settled again. But not in the way it had before. This wasn't focus. It wasn't routine. It was awareness, shared, unspoken. Every one of us feeling the same thing, but not saying it. Because once you said it out loud, it became real, and none of us were ready for that. I stared at the display again, forcing myself to stay grounded in what I could see. Numbers, position, depth, data. But underneath all of that, there was something else now. Something that hadn't been there before. Not in the readings, not in the system, in us. Because the longer it stayed there, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that whatever was beneath us wasn't just following, it was aware. And the way it held that position, perfectly aligned, unmoving, silent. It didn't feel passive anymore. It felt deliberate. Like it wasn't just tracking the ship, it was tracking us, individually. And for the first time that night, I stopped looking at it like a contact and started feeling like we were the ones being observed. Someone finally suggested putting eyes on it. Not casually, not like a normal step in identification. More like we had run out of everything else. "Request visual confirmation," the supervisor said. There was a short delay before the response came through. "Approved. Keep it controlled." That wording stuck with me. Controlled. Like we weren't just deploying equipment. We were doing something that needed to be measured carefully. "Prep the drop," he said. A few of us shifted positions, coordinating without needing much instruction. This wasn't new territory in terms of procedure. We had the tools. We knew how to use them. But the atmosphere had changed. No one spoke unless they had to. Every movement felt deliberate. I kept one eye on the sonar display as preparations were made. The contact was still there. Same position, same depth, unchanged. "Lowering," someone confirmed. The equipment entered the water smoothly. No disruption, no unexpected resistance. From a technical standpoint, everything was functioning exactly as it should. I watched the feed come online. At first, nothing. Just darkness, expected at that depth. The onboard light activated, cutting through the water just enough to give us a limited field of view. Particles drifted slowly through the beam, small, suspended fragments moving with the current. No structure, no shape, no sign of anything large enough to match what we were tracking. "Adjust angle," the supervisor said, and the camera shifted slightly. Still nothing. I glanced back at the sonar. The contact hadn't moved, still directly beneath us, which meant, if the positioning was correct, we should have been looking right at it. "Range confirmed?" someone asked. "Yes," I said. "We're aligned." That didn't make sense. The data was consistent. The positioning was accurate. There was no reason we shouldn't be seeing something. Lower a bit more. The equipment descended further. The feed darkened slightly as we went deeper, the light struggling to reach as far. Still nothing, just open water. Empty. Hold there, the supervisor said. The camera steadied. I watched closely, scanning the edges of the frame, looking for any distortion, any movement that didn't match the rest of the water. There was none. I checked sonar again. The contact was still present. Same position, same depth, exactly where we were looking. And yet, there was nothing there. "That's not right," someone said. "No," I replied. "It's not." A brief pause followed. Then, "Wait," the voice came from behind me. I froze slightly, eyes still on the screen. Sonar, it just shifted. I looked down immediately, for the first time since it had stabilized. The contact moved, not away, not out of range, just slightly off-center, a small adjustment, barely noticeable. But it was there, and the timing. It lined up exactly with the moment we had lowered the equipment into the water. "Confirm that," the supervisor said. "I see it," I replied. "Minor deviation." The room went quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the same kind of silence. This one felt sharper, more alert, because now we had something new. A reaction. Hold position," he said. We did. No movement from the ship, no adjustment, just observation. The contact shifted again, small, controlled, like it was repositioning itself, not to escape, but to adjust. "Pull back slightly," the supervisor ordered. The camera retracted just a bit. The feed changed, angle, lighting, but still showed nothing. Empty water. I checked sonar again. The contact returned to its original position, directly beneath us, perfect alignment, no delay. "Lower again," he said. We repeated the process. The equipment descended. The light cut through the darkness, and again, nothing. But this time, I didn't focus on the feed. I watched the sonar. The moment the camera reached depth, the contact shifted. Same way as before. Small, precise, immediate. Then, as the camera steadied, it returned. That was the pattern. It wasn't avoiding us. It wasn't fleeing. It was reacting to the observation. I felt a tightness in my chest that I hadn't noticed before. Because now this wasn't just about tracking movement. It wasn't just about silence. It was interaction. Not direct, not obvious, but consistent. Every time we tried to see it, it adjusted, just enough to stay out of view. "Kill the feed," the supervisor said quietly. The camera light cut off. The screen went dark. I looked back at sonar. The contact was still there, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. No movement, no variation, just present. The room stayed silent for a long moment. No one spoke, because there was nothing to add. We had done everything right. Positioning, alignment, verification, and still we saw nothing. But sonar told us it was there, exactly where it should have been visible. I leaned back slightly, my eyes still fixed on the display. Because now there was something new layered into everything we had already observed. Not just presence, not just movement, not just silence, but awareness, not confirmed, not proven, but suggested. In the way it reacted, in the timing, in the precision. Like it knew when we were trying to look at it and chose not to be seen. And that thought, it settled in deeper than anything else had so far. Because up until that moment, we were trying to understand what it was. Now, we had to consider something else, that whatever was beneath us understood exactly what we were doing and was responding to it. It moved closer without warning. No buildup, no gradual shift. One moment, it was holding at a consistent depth, and the next, the numbers tightened. "Range decreasing," I said, in my voice lower than before. Everyone in the room looked at the display, because we all saw it. The gap between us and the contact was shrinking, not fast, not aggressive, just steady, deliberate. "Confirm that," the supervisor said. "Confirmed," I replied. "It's coming up." No one spoke after that. We didn't need to. The data was clear. Whatever had been holding position beneath us was now closing the distance. I adjusted the scale, narrowing the range to get a more precise reading. The return grew stronger. Not louder, there was still no sound, but more defined in presence, like it was occupying more space within our field. "Hold course," the supervisor said. The order came quickly, controlled. We weren't maneuvering this time. We were letting it happen. I kept my eyes locked on the display. The depth continued to decrease. Slowly, consistently. Every few seconds, the number shifted just enough to notice. Closer and closer. I became aware of how still the room had gotten. No one moved. No one adjusted position. Even breathing felt quieter. Like any unnecessary movement might disrupt something we didn't understand. "Distance?" someone asked. I gave the updated reading. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Because now it wasn't just unusual. It was close. Closer than anything we had tracked before, without clear identification. I leaned forward slightly, studying the return. It still had no shape, no edge, just a dense, steady presence directly beneath us. But now, the proximity made it feel different, heavier, like the space between us, and it was no longer just water. "Still no acoustic?" the supervisor asked. "None," I said. That didn't change, even now. It's even this close. There was still nothing on the audio feed, no disturbance, no movement, just silence. "Maintain position," he repeated. We held steady, and it kept coming. The numbers dropped again, not dramatically, but enough to feel it. Because now, every small change mattered. Every meter, every shift, brought it closer to a point where distance stopped being theoretical. I swallowed slightly, not realizing my throat had gone dry. Because at this range, it wasn't just something beneath us anymore. It was something very near. "Log everything," the supervisor said. "I am," I replied. My hands moved automatically, recording each change, each timestamp. But my attention wasn't on the log. It was on the contact, on how consistent the movement was. No hesitation, no fluctuation, just a steady approach. Like it had decided to close the gap, and nothing was interrupting that decision. "Why now?" someone whispered. No one answered, because that question didn't have a place in the data. But it was there, in all of us. Why now? After hours of holding position, after tracking us without change, why move closer? The depth reading shifted again, closer. I adjusted the display once more, tightening the focus. The return filled more of the screen, not visually, but in presence. It felt larger, more immediate, even though we still couldn't define it. "Range is minimal," I said. That was the closest I could phrase it without overstepping. Because we were approaching a point where there wasn't much space left. The room stayed silent. No orders, no adjustments, just observation. And that was the part that made it heavier. Because we weren't trying to avoid it anymore. We were letting it come. The numbers dropped again, then slowed, then stopped. Hold, I said quietly. The contact had reached a new position, closer than it had ever been, directly beneath us. No movement, no variation, just there. I stared at the display, waiting for something else to happen. A change, a shift, anything. But nothing came. It didn't move again. It didn't retreat. It didn't advance further. It just held at that distance, in complete silence. I became aware of my own breathing again, slow, controlled, but heavier than before, because now the situation had changed in a way that couldn't be ignored. Before, there had been distance. Now, there wasn't. Still no visual? Someone asked quietly. No, I said. That hadn't changed either. Even now, even this close, there was nothing to see, just empty water, and a presence we could only detect through numbers. I leaned back slightly, but my eyes didn't leave the screen. Because something about this position felt intentional, not random, not exploratory, final. Like it had reached the exact point it wanted and stopped. The room stayed still. No one spoke. Because at that moment, there was nothing left to test, nothing left to adjust. We weren't tracking it anymore. We were sitting directly above it, and whatever was beneath us had chosen to be there, closer than it had ever been, without making a sound, without showing itself, just holding position, like it was waiting for something we couldn't see and couldn't understand. It was there, and then it wasn't. No warning, no transition, just gone. I didn't notice it immediately. For a few seconds, everything looked the same. The display was still active, the system steady, the room silent. My eyes were fixed on the same point they had been for the last several minutes. Then something felt off, not visually at first, just absence. I leaned forward slightly, narrowing my focus. The return wasn't there. Hold on, I said quietly. No one responded. They were already looking. I adjusted the gain, thinking maybe it had weakened, shifted just enough to fall below the threshold. Nothing. I recalibrated the display. Still nothing. Contact lost, I said. That got immediate attention. Confirm, the supervisor said. I'm not seeing it, I replied. No return. Run it again. I did. Full sweep. Clean. Empty. The contact had been there, directly beneath us, closer than anything we had tracked that night. And now, there was nothing. No residual signal, no fading trace, no movement off range, just absence. That's not right, someone said. They were right. Even if something moves out of detection, you usually see it go. A shift in position, a weakening signal, some indication of direction. This didn't move. It didn't fade. It just stopped being there. Check all systems, the supervisor said. Already doing it. Diagnostics came back clean. No faults, no disruption. Everything functioning exactly as it should. Active, he said. I sent the pulse. The return came back, clear, empty, no object, no anomaly, nothing beneath us. Again, same result. I shut down active and returned to passive. Silence. Complete. The same silence we had been sitting in for hours, but now it felt different. Before, it had been occupied. Now, it wasn't, and that made it worse. Where did it go? Someone asked. No one answered, because there was no direction to point to, no data to follow, nothing to track. I scanned the surrounding range, expanding the field, looking for any sign that it had moved laterally, changed depth, done anything that could explain the sudden loss. Nothing. It wasn't nearby. It wasn't deeper. It wasn't anywhere. It had simply disappeared. I leaned back slightly, trying to process it, because this wasn't like losing a normal contact. This wasn't something slipping out of range or dropping below detection. It was too immediate, too clean, like it had been removed. "Log time," the supervisor said. I marked it. The exact second the contact vanished. "Any residual?" he asked. "No, sir." "Nothing?" "Nothing." That word hung in the air, because we had spent hours tracking something that defied everything we understood. And now, there was no trace it had ever been there, except for what we had recorded. The room stayed quiet, but not in the same way as before. This wasn't tension, this was uncertainty, because as strange as it had been, its presence had at least been consistent, predictable in its own way. Now there was nothing to hold on to, no pattern, no behavior, just absence. I looked back at the display again, half expecting it to reappear, same position, same depth, like it had before. But it didn't. The screen remained empty, flat, normal, as if the last several hours had never happened. "Maintain watch," the supervisor said. His voice was steady, controlled, but quieter than before. We all stayed in position. No one moved away, not yet, because there was still that feeling that it wasn't over, even without the contact. I kept scanning, running through frequencies, adjusting filters, looking for anything we might have missed, but there was nothing, no anomaly, no distortion, no sign of movement, just open water and silence. I exhaled slowly, realizing how tense I had been. My shoulders felt heavier, my focus less sharp now that there was nothing to lock onto, but something didn't settle. It should have. The contact was gone. That should have brought relief. It didn't, because of how it happened. Too sudden, too complete, like it hadn't moved away, but simply stopped allowing itself to be detected. I glanced around the room. Everyone was still focused, still watching, even without anything to see, because we all felt it, the same thing. The absence wasn't empty. It felt deliberate, like whatever had been beneath us hadn't left. It had just changed something we couldn't measure, something we couldn't track. And the worst part was, there was no way to prove that, no data, no signal, nothing to point to, just the memory of something that had been there for hours, closer than it should have been, perfectly aligned, completely silent, and then gone, without a trace, without a direction, without any explanation at all. They told us to return to normal operations, just like that. No follow-up briefing, no explanation, no acknowledgement beyond a few short instructions passed down through command. Resume standard watch. That was it. The room didn't change right away. No one moved. No one spoke. Because normal didn't feel like something we could just switch back to. I kept my eyes on the display for a while longer, even though there was nothing there anymore. Just open water, clean readings, no anomalies, exactly the way it had been before any of this started, but it didn't feel the same. "Stand down from anomaly tracking," the supervisor said quietly. A few of us nodded, more out of habit than agreement. Hands moved, systems reset, logs finalized. Everything transitioned back to routine. But the pace felt slower, like everyone was moving through something thicker than usual. I leaned back slightly, finally allowing myself to look away from the screen for more than a second. The room looked the same. Same equipment, same lighting, same people. But the atmosphere hadn't returned to what it was before. Something had settled in, not panic, not even fear, just wait. Log submitted, someone said. Copy, the supervisor replied. His voice was steady, but there was less in it now, less edge, less urgency, because whatever had happened was over, at least officially. I glanced back at the display one more time. Still nothing, no trace, no residual signal, no indication that anything had ever been there. If someone walked in at that moment, they wouldn't have known anything unusual had occurred. And that was the part that felt wrong, because we knew, all of us, we had watched it, tracked it, tested it, for hours, and now there was nothing. End of report, the supervisor said. That was the closest thing to closure we got. No discussion, no breakdown, just an endpoint. The officers who had been standing in the room began to leave, one by one. Same way they arrived, quiet, controlled, no extra words, no visible reaction. That stood out more than anything, because if this had been routine, they wouldn't have stayed that long. And if it wasn't, they weren't showing it. I shifted in my seat, rolling my shoulders slightly. The tension was still there, subtle, lingering, like something hadn't fully released. You good? The operator beside me asked. I nodded. Yeah. But it wasn't a complete answer, because I wasn't sure what good meant after that. We sat there for a few more minutes, going through the motions of normal operations, checking systems, reviewing standard data. Everything looked exactly the way it should. But the focus wasn't the same. Every now and then, someone would glance back at the spot on the display where the contact had been. Not intentionally, just automatically. Like the mind hadn't caught up yet, like it still expected something to be there. I did the same thing, more than once, and every time, it was empty. I exhaled slowly, letting the air out through my nose, trying to settle, trying to move on to the next part of the shift. Because that's what we were supposed to do. That's what training teaches you. You observe, you report, you return to baseline. But something about this didn't fit into that cycle, because there was no explanation, no classification, no closure, just an event that started, stayed, and then ended without resolution. Probably just some kind of anomaly, someone said eventually. The words sounded forced, not wrong, just incomplete. I didn't respond, because there wasn't anything to add. An anomaly doesn't track movement like that. It doesn't adjust when observed. It doesn't hold position for hours, then disappear without a trace. I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms against the console again. The screen remained unchanged, calm, normal, but the memory of what had been there didn't fade. If anything, it stayed sharper, because of how consistent it had been, how controlled, how deliberate. I glanced down at the log one last time. Timestamps, data points, movement records, everything we had captured. Proof that something had been there. Even if we couldn't explain it, even if no one outside that room ever saw it the way we did. I closed the log. Systems were back to standard. The shift continued. But the feeling didn't leave, not completely, because even without the contact, there was still something sitting in the back of my mind, something that didn't match the idea that it was over. I looked at the display again, empty, still, exactly how it should be. And that's when the thought settled in, not sudden, not dramatic, just quiet, the same way everything else had happened that night. We didn't lose it. It didn't leave. It just stopped showing itself. And whatever had been beneath us, for those hours we tracked it, matching every movement, holding perfect position, staying completely silent. It made a decision not to move away, not to disappear, but to no longer be detected. I sat there for a moment longer, letting that settle, because there was no way to prove it, no data to support it, nothing I could point to, just a feeling, the same one that had been building all night, that subtle sense that we weren't the only ones observing. And as the shift continued, as everything returned to routine, that thought stayed with me, unchanged, quiet, persistent, that whatever had been beneath us was still out there, somewhere below, not gone, just watching from a place we couldn't reach anymore.